My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds or geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic, multiverses, mega Christmas, strangest franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope. Beef Pork Ribs is not here today because he just got married yesterday, and I think we can all agree we'd rather he and Mjolnir, who are now married, get to actually spend some time together and their family, instead of being here podcasting. And I got to watch the ceremony virtually through Facebook Live. Mjolnir had this beautiful, super poofy dress. I don't think I've ever seen Beef Pork Ribs look so happy, even though it's through like a Facebook Live grainy video thing. So we certainly wish them the best. And he's now the third co-host of mine that has gotten married since they started working on the podcast. Because technically, when Dr. What first came on, he wasn't married yet, and Pixel Patch wasn't married yet, and now Beef Pork Ribs and Mjolnir are married. So this podcast certainly is not creating these couples. It's just let's see when he comes back next week if he sounds happier because he's married now. We'll see. But because there was such a reference to him in our 200th episode, we do have back in our studio for the first time since his first landmark, most popular episode appearance, Professor F. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Average Joe. It's good to be back.
Now, you know this because we live together, and I'm always telling you that your previous episode about Transformers Rescue Bots is the most popular episode we've ever had. So I'm curious, how do you feel about that?
I'm probably as perplexed as you are. I'm happy to have been part of such a cultural phenomenon on your podcast, but I don't think it's anything to do with my performance or my take on Rescue Bots that projected it or propelled it to such stellar heights of downloads.
And Ben the Movie Buff, you are back with us again this week.
Hey, how are ya? Yes, I am. I find that anytime we talk about movies, I have to do my best to be here to chat with you guys. I probably won't be on the next few podcast episodes just because I'll be working on Sundays for the next few weeks on this production that I start tomorrow. But yes, I'm super thrilled to talk about Houston. We have a problem, which is Apollo 13.
And we have a new guest with us this week, which is exciting. I should really keep track of how many guests we've had on the podcast. I want to say it's at least 25, but I'm not good at math. That's been firmly established many times that I suck at math. So we welcome for the first time to the Bachelor podcast, Knit Stitch.
Hi, thanks for having me, Average Joe. It's great to be here. I've been listening to the Bachelor podcast, so it's kind of a fun moment for me to be here in the studio.
Now, whenever we have a new guest come on the show, we want our audience to kind of get to know them a bit. And we ask them a couple questions. The first one, very important for, what this kind of podcast is. What kind of nerd or geek are you?
So I knew this question was coming, having listened to a few other episodes where people came on and got asked the same question. And I was trying to reflect on this morning a little bit. I think I definitely fall more into the nerd side of things in that I like to kind of get into stuff, but I keep it to myself. I have a number of interests that people probably would be surprised about, but I think a lot of my nerdiness is around history and literature. But I also have quite a bit of fantasy and sci-fi thrown in there, mostly from my childhood and, big Star Wars fan. growing up. So yeah, I have a little bit of everything. I generally just like to dabble.
A dabbler. Okay, maybe that's an interesting quality. We are recording at a table today because for the first time in forever, we actually have a group of us in the same room. Beef Pork Ribs is the only one recording remotely, so I just need a table, and hopefully that sounded great for everyone listening. But all right, Knit Stitch, what kind of nerd or geek do you want to be?
I'm pretty happy actually being a dabbler. Like I feel like there's so much out there just to kind of get into, enjoy a little bit. Yeah, I don't really see myself going too deeply into anything except, as I mentioned, history. I did get a degree in classics, so spent 4 years of my life doing that one. So right now, happy to just jump in and out of things as they come up.
Fair enough. Would you say you're a Jill of all trades?
I guess, yeah. There's not too much I probably haven't, at least dabbled it a little bit in.
Okay, well, we're happy to have you dabble with us on the show today. Professor F, you have been on the show for over a year now. So what kind of nerdy or geeky things that have not been initiated by me have you been up to?
I don't know if everyone would consider this nerdy, but I've been getting into photography more, I guess, since, it was February of 2019, now that you mention it, or winter of 2019. So since then, I've bought a new camera. I've been getting a bit more into photography, looking up some photography techniques. I've also been continuing to look more into space exploration, everything that's going on right now with the private industry, with SpaceX and Blue Origin, and with NASA as well, and the upcoming moon missions. So naturally, I was very excited to take part in this podcast. I'm happy to have had the opportunity. Yeah, those are a good number of the things I've been up to.
By how we define what a nerd and a geek are, I would actually say you're a photography geek because you try to, with your students anyway, I know you try to get them into photography.
That's true.
And you're very, I would say you're very prone towards like bringing people into your photography by either showing it on social media or like explaining to others like what's exciting about the photography tools you're using.
That's a good point. I mean, there's definitely, I see a nerd as someone who really delves deep into something. I know that's a different sort of definition. A geek can do that too, but I guess there is a geeky side to it as well, in that I quite enjoy seeing others get involved in photography.
I mean, it's still like we just had an episode a few weeks ago kind of trying to attack this idea of defining nerd and geek again. We still don't have much clarity, but one thing that really seems to resonate for me is that a nerd pursues their interest in like a solitary by themselves sort of way because it's something they enjoy for themselves, which is kind of how Knit Stitch described her enjoyment of certain things. Whereas a geek will want to share their experience with other people. And I know, Ben, the movie buff, you've kind of talked about how with movies, you're both a nerd and a geek.
Yes, that's correct. I guess it depends on the movie, depends on what I like to do. But yes, I definitely kind of relate to both spectrums, and I guess it just depends on how I'm feeling. But yeah, I think it would be maybe too much if I shared everything with all the people that I know, but then it would also to be on the other side of the spectrum where I don't share any movies with anyone. I don't talk with anyone about movies. I just keep it by myself. That would also get a little lonely. So I try and find that happy balance somewhere in the middle.
Well, this episode is not about defining nerd and geek again. Maybe in another 50 episodes, we'll try and come back to that and really hammer out the definitive definitions of those words. One can only hope. One thing that Beef Pork Ribs has kind of commented on as we've done our reflections on 4 years and 200 episodes is that we really haven't been covering the news lately. And so one piece of nerdy or geeky news that was just announced this past week that I really want us to talk about is there is going to be a new Star Wars holiday special. Now, listeners of the podcast who've been around for a while will know that about a year ago for Christmas, Dr. What and I actually reviewed the Star Wars holiday special. And it is every bit as amusing and painful as you imagine it to be. I would just go listen to that episode to see how we feel about it. But there is indeed a new Star Wars holiday special coming to Disney Plus later this month. It just got its own trailer. And the one key difference is that this one is going to be all in Lego.
I mean, I have some disappointment that the child from the Mandalorian puppet will not be there because first thing I thought was Star Wars holiday, I just want that kind of cuteness. I just pictured him in a little Santa hat.
I hadn't considered whether the Baby Yoda character, as he's more popularly referred to, would be in it or not. That would be pretty cute addition. But I'm excited. I haven't seen any of like the spin-off Lego movies, like the Batman one or anything, but I've seen them two mainline Lego movies. And if it's anything in that style, I would quite enjoy it. I really liked those two movies, and I'm also a very big Star Wars fan, so it seems like a good combination to me.
Now, I know for a fact neither of you've actually watched the trailer.
No.
So
No.
before we go any further, we're actually going to take a moment to let you guys experience the trailer and we'll continue our conversation. All right, so we just finished watching the trailer for the Lego Star Wars Holiday Special. Ben, the movie buff, since you've previously seen the trailer, I'm sure you have thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Geez. So, just to give a little bit of context, I saw the Star Wars Holiday Special, the live action one that they did, I think, in 1979 or 1980. And as bad as it is, it's very bad, but I have such a blast with it that I've seen it on like 3 or 4 occasions, and I may watch it again in the coming months as we get closer to Christmas. So, yeah, I was definitely pretty exhilarated when I heard that they were going to do another Star Wars holiday special, but this time it's going to be animated and with Lego. And that I would love to think that this will be substantially better quality than the original holiday special. And yeah, from what I can tell regarding the trailer, it does look like a lot of fun. And really, that's kind of all that I'm hoping for is that it's fun, enjoyable, and that I have a good laugh here and there. And I think that the idea of time travel, of Rey being able to go through all the different episodes of the Star Wars events, is definitely not the most original idea because we know of lots of different franchises that have dabbled with time travel, but it still seems like a fun idea. And, like it definitely seems like fan fiction on steroids where they're going to have all these really fun possibilities and things that they can do now that they have our characters, I would assume from like the most recent sequel trilogy, being able to go into the other trilogies and to other past events. So I'm pretty excited for it, and I don't know if I'll watch it immediately when it comes out on Disney Plus. I might wait until closer to when we're in December. But yeah, I'm excited, and I hope it's good.
You guys in the room with me, you just watched it for the first
Yeah.
time. So I heard you laugh a couple times and you definitely like got excited when the child showed up.
Yeah, that was pretty exciting. I'm very happy to see that. I kind of thought they'd have to stick with one time period or like one era of Star Wars. So the thought of everything mashing together, that was pretty fun.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to seeing it. There's not a lot in theaters or not a lot of new releases, as I'm sure has been talked about on the podcast. So to have something come out that looks as fun as this, um, and have it reference so many different Star Wars episodes, even the holiday special itself, Life Day, 'twas the night before Life Day or whatever Yoda said. Yeah, it looks like there's a lot of inside references for fans. Yeah, it looks great.
Now, Professor F, you made reference to the Lego movies, the ones that
Mhm.
were released in theaters. As far as I know, this actually is nothing to do with
Okay.
those. I think this is actually just like some group at Lucasfilm because there have been lots of Lego Star Wars, but they've been mostly like direct to video kind of movies
Yeah.
for kids and
Mhm.
stuff. So this actually is not at all related to like the Lego movies that have gone out in
Okay.
theaters. And I guess that brings the question I have is like, I would rather this not be in Lego. I would think this would work just as well. If I understand like you can't get all these actors in live action to do the parts, especially the ones from like the original movies.
Yeah.
But I would have preferred this to be like just a regular traditional animated special instead of a Lego one.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I think Lego can add maybe to the corniness of it. But yeah, it could probably be done in traditional animation. That's a good point.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice, but at the same time, I know like the actual Lego sets for Star Wars are really popular.
Mm.
And you see them just referenced in a number of other things. I think they had Stranger Things featured some of the sets, and so I can see how they could pull it in. It makes more sense than maybe some other franchises going into Lego, just because of the popularity of the actual sets out there.
Yeah, two things. The first thing I was going to say is while, yeah, this upcoming holiday special, I don't think, has as much in common with the actual Lego movies that have been released in theaters. I wouldn't be surprised if it still kind of has the fun and the silliness and even like the zaniness, right? Like I did see Lego Batman movie last year, which was a lot of fun, and it was one of those things where like it was just so colorful and there was so much going on a lot of the time and so many jokes that I wouldn't be surprised if this Star Wars Lego special kind of has that same flavor, if you will, even if it is on kind of a more basic level. But then, yeah, when it comes to like it being in Lego, I wouldn't be surprised if it has something to do with the fact that it just because once again, too, I'm not exactly sure. Like, is this going to be a 45-minute special? Is it going to be feature length, like 90 minutes? But I wouldn't be surprised if it has something to do with surfaces and textures, right? When you think about it, if we are doing this in traditional animation, that means characters like Chewbacca. That means other aliens. Depending on their look, the animation could take a lot longer. But when you're working with Lego, especially the kind of Lego that we see in this trailer, I wouldn't be surprised if that helps them kind of speed up the process a little bit so that they're able to make something a little quicker than something that would probably take longer if you had to animate hair and animate, I don't know, scales and other kinds of textures. So just a guess, but I can also see why this is also a case of like, oh, you're marketing towards the Star Wars fans and you're also marketing towards the Lego fans. So I think they'll get a lot of people checking this out.
Yeah, I guess I'm partially motivated to see it in just like traditional or computer animation because I'm watching Star Wars Rebels right now and I'm super into it. And I'm like, I guess by having it look Lego, you're right. It's easier to animate, and it kind of like tells you right away this is meant to be silly. Like it's not meant to be taken seriously. Like Rebels is often meant to be taken seriously. And I agree with you, Professor F. It definitely seems like Star Wars fans are involved in making this because some of the references they make in the trailer, like to Kylo Ren's physique, or the fact that the child is cute, or the fact that there's a joke about the whole Han shot first thing. Like those are Star Wars fan things, and so for the actual Star Wars brand to acknowledge the kind of like things that have been talked about in the fandom, I feel like you don't really hear that a lot in other media. Like you don't ever hear like Marvel movies like directly referencing things the Marvel fans are saying. So I don't know if this is them trying to build some goodwill after the sequel trilogy ended the way it did, but it's got my vote so far.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll definitely be watching it. I don't think maybe if I hadn't seen the trailer, I probably wouldn't have clicked on something that was a Lego Star Wars. I think that there are other episodes I've seen on like Disney Plus. There have been other maybe shorts done, but having seen this, I definitely just even for those inside jokes, I would love to kind of see how they play with it all.
Even the release date is an Easter egg. It's coming out November 17th, which was the exact date in 1978 that the original holiday special aired on television. So, like the cuts are deep in this. And yeah, I'm super excited. Sounds like we'll all check out at some point, and we'll definitely be having that be our podcast episode the week it comes out. So, as I just mentioned, the Lego Star Wars Holiday Special, man, that's a title, is coming out on Disney Plus on November 17th. So mark your calendars, folks. As Professor F mentioned, there's not a lot coming out in theaters these days. Except I did see a trailer for a movie called Fat Man, which is about Mel Gibson
that was
Santa
weird
Claus,
looking.
who's like being hunted by a kid who got a piece of coal for Christmas.
And surprise, surprise, I worked on that movie for 2 days, so I'm also pretty interested to see what it's going to be like.
Yeah, I mean the way things are going, pretty much every movie that was scheduled to be released this fall has vacated the schedule. I just saw this week that both Death on the Nile and Free Guy have vacated their release dates in December. So the next movie that's scheduled to come out is Wonder Woman 84 on Christmas Day. But at this point, I mean, it seems like it's going to be less and less likely. So who knows what'll happen to Fat Man? Hopefully, he'll get a streaming release because I'd love to talk about that movie as well. It seems like a very atypical Christmas film. But anyway, we're off topic. We are here today to talk about Apollo 13, which is a movie that came out in 1995, I think. We watched it today on Amazon Prime. Oof. I am having a real hard time with this table. Anyway, 1995. We watched it on Amazon Prime. before watching it today, I'd never actually seen this film. And I think part of that stems from the fact that I've never been a big space guy. I've never really cared at all about astronauts going into space. My interest in like space in general is related to like Star Wars, which I know is so far removed from what actual space travel and all that looks like. But Professor F, I know that you are indeed a big space guy, so I'm kind of curious. Can you bring us into like what got you excited about this whole space thing?
That's hard to say. I think it might be a Star Wars connection, at least in part for me as well. My dad saw the original Star Wars, I guess, in his 20s, maybe late 20s. Yeah. And loved it. And so I was born between, I think, yeah, before episode 6 came out. So I was born between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And my dad, as early as he thought he could safely introduce me to the Star Wars trilogy, he did. I think I was like 6 years old when he showed me episode 4, and I loved it. And that kind of started off the whole space fascination for me. But it didn't just stay on in the sci-fi realm. I very much became interested in the space shuttle missions, the different probed missions to Mars, and the Hubble telescope and the images coming from that. So it's maybe strange that I haven't actually watched Apollo 13 myself before. Growing up, I actually wasn't that interested in the lunar missions because it seemed like it happened in a different era of the NASA history, and it seemed like almost low tech, even though they accomplished this great achievement. So it's only been in kind of more recent decades, like as an adult, that I've started to really appreciate the missions, precisely for what they were able to accomplish at the very infancy of spaceflight. So I was, yeah, I was very happy to be able to see the movie today.
Now, Ned Stitch, you talk about history being something you dabble in. Can I assume that, like, I don't know, the space exploration history fall into that broad category?
A little bit. It's a bit more modern history than I usually do, but I actually have always had a love for space. At one point, I think I had decided I was going to become an astronaut archaeologist because my dream for many years was to be an archaeologist. But then I was like, being an astronaut would be super cool, and I figured by then maybe there'd be some kind of archaeology up there, you know. Um, so yeah, so I know a bit about space, kind of here and there. It's definitely something I've dabbled in though, more than actually researched.
I mean, I remember being in the first grade, and my dream job was to be a priest in space, an astronaut priest. And very quickly, like by the time I was in grade 2, I lost interest in both those career paths. So that's the closest I've ever been to being interested in space. So Ben, the movie buff, I think you mentioned watching this movie before. Are you in any way a space fan?
A little bit. I'll be honest, I don't know that much about space, but I do remember. I mean, I'm interested in space insofar as it deals with movies. So I have seen a lot of science fiction movies. So in that regard, I am interested in space. And yeah, this movie I saw probably as a kid shortly after it came out, but I haven't seen this movie in over 10 years. So it was interesting to rewatch it recently. And yeah, I also remember being into space back in high school because I remember I had a project where we had to look up at the night sky during the winter and look at the various constellations. And I remember I had some sort of assignment regarding constellations of stars, and I had a lot of fun with that.
So as I mentioned, this movie came out in 1995. So in our conversation today, we're going to go full. First of all, this is inspired and based on true events. So really, you can't really spoil history. I mean, I guess you could, but it's available everywhere, guys. This is like it's part of American history, human history. So for us to like spoil the movie, it'd be kind of redundant. So we're going to talk about the movie without no full spoilers for Apollo 13. I think that's fair, right? Spoilers for American history. Just get that out of the way. So first of all, this is a movie that is based on a memoir, like a book that one of the people that's like one of the characters in the movie wrote about his experiences. So Ben, the movie buff, I want to go to you first because you're the biggest movie buff here. It's in your name. Would you consider Apollo 13 a biopic?
The Apollo 13 spacecraft is apparently losing breathing oxygen. The emergency has ruled out any chance of a lunar landing.
Why are so many people here?
Something broke on your daddy's spaceship.
I have a request from the news people.
Take it up with my husband. He'll be home on Friday.
Slightly, I've lost the radio contact.
Econ, what's your data telling you?
It's reading a quadruple failure. That can't happen. It's got to be instrumentation.
The ship's bleeding to death.
This rate, we're going to skip right out of the atmosphere, and we're never going to get back.
Well, we're looking at less than 15 minutes of life support in the Odyssey. We never lost an American in space. We're sure as hell not going to lose one on my watch.
Odyssey, do you read me?
How long does it take to power up the LEM?
3 hours by the checklist.
We don't have that much time.
Okay, I think... I guess the straight answer to that is no. I would argue that a biopic, because from what I can tell, the events of Apollo 13 happen within a year, I think, right? Because I was just double checking dates about the first time that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, when they landed on the moon, and that was in July of 1969. The Apollo 13 mission was in April of 1970, and the movie begins with Jim Lovell, who I believe that's the biography that they were using for the commander of the Apollo 13 mission. It starts with him and his friends and family watching the moon landing in July 1969, and then they go into space within a year after that. So in a way, like, sure, you could kind of make the argument that it's a biopic because we do learn a fair amount about him. But by the same token, the movie is also about the mission. So it's about the astronauts in space. It's about mission control at NASA trying to save them. It's about Lovell's wife, Marilyn, I think her name is, who's, obviously very, very concerned that she will never see her husband again, but she still holds out hope. So I don't know. I would say a biopic is more focused about like having a main character that we spend a lot of time with. And I feel like we need to see them in more time than just like 9 months, because this movie, has a lot going on, but it's very much about the mission and all the different people that are related to that mission. So yeah, I'd say it's mildly a biopic, but not entirely, not like movies like Gandhi or The Aviator or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just to briefly describe the plot of the movie, it's about Forrest Gump, the guy from Twister, and the guy from Footloose going to space to land on the moon, and something bad happens, and they basically realize they're not going to be able to land on the moon, and so it's a big mission to try and get them back to Earth safely because stuff has gone wrong on their spaceship. And Lieutenant Dan is there on the ground because he was supposed to be sick or something, and he helps them figure out how to land successfully. I say that because, Bill Paxton's in this movie. He was really prominent like the 90s as an actor. Like, he was in a bunch of stuff like Twister, but he hasn't really done anything recently, and so that's kind of why I reference him in relation to that. And even for Kevin Bacon, like, outside of Footloose, like, he never quite, at least from my perspective, outside of being an X-Men First Class, he hasn't really done anything recently. So in my mind, he's still the kid from Footloose. Tom Hanks, yes, he's been in lots of stuff, so he could be any number of characters he's played, not just Forrest Gump. But there you go, that's that. Now, being based on a memoir, it's supposed to be that person's recounting of the events from their point of view. So I have not read this book. I think it's called Lost Moon. I have not read that book, so I don't know if he actually consulted NASA space logs and all this stuff as he was writing it. Oh, you're waving your hand at me.
Yeah, so I was looking that up because as we were watching it, Average Joe and I were debating this point a bit about how historically accurate it would be. And regardless of whether to classify it as a biopic or not, I was just reading up a bit about the movie. And is it Ron Howard that directed? Yeah. Yeah, he did base it a lot on NASA transcripts of mission control logs, like mission logs from the astronauts. Went to a lot of time to recreate mission control to the extent that NASA consultant that they had on the set, every time he would leave the pseudo mission control that they built, he would apparently look for the elevator and before realizing that he wasn't actually at NASA. So they went through a lot of detail. It sounds like the book maybe was the inspiration for the movie, but then they really took a lot of effort to make it as historically accurate as possible. They even put the actors through a crash course in physics so they would understand some of the terms they were using.
So I'm going to just lay a claim here that you are the resident space expert in this podcast today. As far as you're concerned, did it seem fairly accurate?
Yeah, it did. I didn't catch all the terms. I mean, I don't know enough about all the jargon, especially from that era, but even today, all the jargon that NASA uses. But they were definitely not just talking slang. Um, I had my doubts about the argument that they have up in space, where they all get hot headed about whose fault it was that the accident happened. And sure enough, they did add that in to the movie for effect. That didn't seem like the sort of they train astronauts to be very level headed and cool under pressure. And a lot of these, especially in that era, were coming out of time as being test pilots. That was often the route to NASA because it was, it was so critical that these men know how to fly these machines that were, barely, such new technology. It was untested, really, in a lot of ways. So, to be a test pilot, you need to be cool under pressure. So, they added little things like that for artistic license, but by and large, it did feel like very believable. And just as you pointed out yourself when you watched it, just how much they focused not just on the men in space, but on the engineers, the flight controllers on the ground working the problem and coming up with the solution for the astronauts.
Yeah, I guess, and also to not call it a biopic kind of helps its credibility, because I've seen a lot of sports movies that are based on real people's lives, or even movies like Patch Adams, where they completely change parts of the person's life to make it more dramatic for a film. So I feel like if we save the trouble of calling Apollo 13 a biopic about Tom Hanks's character, it kind of protects the film as its ability to be historically accurate.
Yeah, it definitely seemed to be almost more of a historical reenactment of this event. Like when we were watching it, Professor F was showing me sometimes they literally were taking the dialogue was out of the audio, because they have the whole thing up on the NASA website and you can see those chunks of conversation. So yeah, it really felt almost I don't want to say documentary style, but it was, I think, meant to be a very much an accurate reenactment, which was interesting. It wasn't about necessarily the drama because it was tense and dramatic enough as it was.
Yeah, I think one of the cool things about this movie and what I would commend it on is that um, I find with movies like this, like even in my case, like I said earlier, how I'm interested in space exploration and all that, but that doesn't mean that I know all the technical terms and that I know a great deal about the shuttles and the lunar modules and all that jazz. So I think rewatching this movie, what's quite impressive is the fact that there's a lot of technical talk, right? Especially when mission control is trying to figure out how do we get our men home. There's lots of discussion about, well, can we do this? Can we do that? Is this going to work? And I know that whoever wrote the script had to figure out how do we make all this technical talk interesting, and how do we make sure that our audience can follow it? Because I know with movies like this, you will have some people who are familiar with these terms and know what's going on and can understand that, when someone, I don't know, makes a quick reference to a certain part of the ship, that people watching it will go, oh yeah, I know exactly what they're talking about. But for people like me, I would miss that. So I think there's a number of good reminders, especially on important things that we need to know. For example, the angle that they need to come in to enter Earth's atmosphere, that they say, oh, if it's too steep, they'll burn up. If it's not steep enough, they'll just hop off the atmosphere and they'll be lost in space. So there's a lot of good ways that they kind of communicate these ideas to the audience to let us know, here's the problem, here's what it could result in, and here's what we're trying to do to save them. And there's a fair amount of that because there's lots of problems for them to figure out along the way, and I think they do a good job with it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I noticed is that they would often cut to people on TV explaining the situation, on the news, because I've heard this critique of TV and film that when you're in a situation where everyone involved actually understands the terminology and the process, they wouldn't go there told to explain it. So if you're in a hospital, they're not going to explain, oh, we need to do a blah 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 for this particular reason, because everyone there knows we got to do this, and so they do it. But if you're watching that, I have no experience with medical stuff, I need to be explained what this is that they're doing, because how am I supposed to be interested? And that was certainly one thing they did with Apollo 13, is they just cut back to the news coverage a lot to try and explain the kind of scientific-y stuff for the lay people like myself. Now, we've mentioned Ron Howard here. He started in the biz as an actor on Happy Days. He was like the main character on Happy Days, and he transitioned later on in his career to directing. So I'm curious, Ben, because you're the movie buff, I got to ask you this. Like, I've heard him referred to as an actor's director, meaning that because he was an actor himself, he understands like how to work with actors and how to get the best performances out of them. And granted, like my favorite Ron Howard movie is still The Grinch, and he he famously ended up working on the Solo movie. So I'm curious, like, would you say it's accurate to call him an actor's director?
Yeah, I would say so. On top of Happy Days, he also, like, he was a child actor. I believe he was in The Music Man in the 60s, and he was also on the Andy Griffith Show. So, from my understanding, he did a good amount of acting. Like, he'd done years and years of acting before he'd gotten his first directing gig. And I think his first directing gig was in the late 70s. So I think he'd been acting for roughly 10 to 15 years before he got his first directing gig. And I think, I mean, from what I can understand, because remember, like I've acted and directed my own shorts before, but like I haven't done it quite professionally, not yet at least. But yeah, I would think being an actor that long gives you experience, gives you knowledge about, like for yourself, how to act with other actors, depending on what kind of thing you're doing, whether you're doing TV or movies. So yeah, I would agree with that sentiment, because I'd be very surprised if someone who acts for 10 or 15 years becomes a director and then like forgets how to communicate with actors or whatnot, right? And I think we see that a lot, how like, Kevin Costner was an actor before he was a director. Clint Eastwood was an actor before he was a director. And I think it goes to show that, yeah, in a way, it can give you this advantage to figure out how to best communicate to actors to find that dynamic that works. That means that you can kind of create something special. And I think, yeah, he was able to do that because he's had quite a good career since he started directing in the late 70s.
But more interesting, he's pretty much stopped acting. Like you mentioned, Clint Eastwood or Kevin Costner, or like Ben Affleck. Those guys all direct, but then they often are actually starring in those movies as well. So it's interesting to see how he kind of transitioned away from acting on screen altogether.
Yes, that's a great point, and I think it goes to show how sometimes people who want to work in film will kind of do something that they're good at, like in this case, being an actor, and I guess after a while, people who act sometimes they just want to continue acting, and I mean I get it, right? Because there's a lot of benefits when it comes to acting, but then yeah, in some cases, if there's something else you want to do, then you stick with that, and I can see being a director, especially of Ron Howard's caliber, can really help you out. And yes, that is a good point. That yeah, some actors will still kind of direct and then go back to acting, but it would seem that he got into directing and he never looked back.
I mean, I don't think I really have a whole lot that I can judge that on. I know that a lot of the actors in this movie are very experienced actors anyway. So, I don't know, but I did find that even though I knew the ending and I knew what was going to happen, I think I was the only one of us in the room who'd actually even seen the movie. I was just as tense. Like I felt just as drawn into the situation. So I mean, they obviously did something. I wasn't distracted by kind of thinking, oh well, that's kind of a weird thing to say or a weird way to act. Like I was drawn in. They were those people, and I felt for them. So.
Yeah, I would take a similar position to Knit Stitch. I don't know how I would go about rating it, like if how it compares to other movies in this genre, but the acting didn't take away from the story or distract from the story for me at all. Um, it felt natural. It felt believable. It seemed like, aside from that, some of those more dramatic moments, like I said, the argument up in the capsule. But even then, it didn't seem like they were out of character, and it seemed, it all seemed to fit. None of it seemed strange to me.
Because if you think about it, most of this movie takes place in two locations. the space shuttle and command. What's it called? Command control.
Yeah, mission control or
mission
yeah.
control. So when you're limited with the number of locations you have to work with, and it's like the same actors in the same locations, I feel I walked away from this movie not feeling bored. Like I was super engaged, and I think that had a lot to do with how the actors in both, like you could tell from the guys in Mission Control how tired they were. That it seemed as though they'd been up for hours and days trying to crack this stuff. And of course, the guys on the spacecraft seemed like they were actually experiencing all the physiological things with their body language, as well as like the emotional and psychological elements.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the performances, because yeah, I think all the performances are great. Even though Tom Hanks definitely still kind of feels like his usual Tom Hanks persona, Marilyn Lovell, the actual Marilyn Lovell, when she saw this movie, she said that Tom Hanks had nailed her husband's mannerisms and way of talking. So from the sounds of it, they'd all done good research into their characters and all done a good job. Fun fact, Kathleen Quinlan, who plays Marilyn Lovell, and Ed Harris, who plays Gene Kranz, who's kind of the guy in control at Mission Control, both got nominated for their performances, which I totally get. And I also wanted to mention how I think what I love, this might be a directing choice, but even when it comes to the performances that we see on screen, what's really great is that there are a few moments where we get to see our actors breathe, right? Sometimes when you're hearing big news or whatnot, you might kind of react quickly and, oh, if I'm sad, I'm going to start crying. If I'm angry, I'm going to start freaking out and raising my voice. But I really like how some of these characters get the opportunity to, like, we get to see the gears in their head turning as we try and read their thoughts from the good performances that they're giving to try and figure out what's going on in their head. My favorite example of this is when Ken Mattingly is told that because of the blood work that was tested that he has the measles, he can't go to space, and Jim Lovell has to be the one to tell him that he's not going to space. And when we cut to his reaction after having heard this news, you'd think that, oh, a few seconds of silence and then he's going to start talking or start losing his mind. Excuse me. You think he's going to start getting angry or start losing his mind. But what's really interesting is that for what felt like 15 or 20 seconds, Gary Sinise is just kind of in deep thought. He kind of looks down at the ground. He's trying to figure out what to say. He looks at Jim Lovell. He's kind of looking around, and he kind of really takes his time before he says anything. And I actually think that's pretty powerful because if he reacts sooner, we know exactly how he's feeling. But the longer and longer we don't hear from him, the more we wonder, like, what's going on in his head? What is going to happen here? And there's actually kind of a funny line later on that when they need Ken's help and they kind of get into his bedroom, the guys from NASA, one of the guys says, "Oh, good, you're not dead." And I guess maybe there's this concern that, like, were they thinking he was going to commit suicide because he wasn't able to go on to the mission? So thank goodness he didn't, because he ends up helping the guys get home. But for that reason, I think the performances are really awesome.
Yeah, I think one thing I really appreciate is they don't overact any of it. Like they let the actual drama of the situation be the center point. Like it's not about their reactions. And I think that feels very true to life, especially as we were mentioning the training that astronauts go through. Like they wouldn't be these people flying off the handle, because that's not who you want to be stuck in a tiny little capsule with for however long in a dangerous situation. So I really appreciated that. Like it was tense, it was dramatic, but it wasn't because people were making it overblown.
Yeah, that's a good point you bring up. It's about the dramatic element of it, not so much the acting, but just the overall scenes. You and I have been watching The Right Stuff on Disney Plus. It's a National Geographic miniseries about the first days of NASA, the Mercury program, and we've both commented like how it seems overly dramatic at times, like it seems built up and tense all the time sometimes. And we had a lot of those similar situations here, the press conferences and things, and it didn't seem overdone. It seemed fitting. It seemed tense or dramatic, as much as the situation would seem to me in real life. It didn't seem like they were trying too hard to make the story tense or gritty or dark or whatever, like some shows do today. 25 years after this movie was made.
Now, when I was watching it, I kind of observed two major messages that the movie was trying to give us that I'm sure are not from the mission logs. And I'm presuming that, again, having not read the book, I'm presuming these are coming from either the memoir or the director and writer trying to say something. But they certainly really paint a picture of what like the experience of like a spouse of astronauts is like through this film. And they also provide a commentary on like the American public's interest in the space program. And obviously the first point talking about like the experience of the spouse, we do follow the main astronaut's wife kind of throughout the movie, and you see the different highs and lows that kind of come with being the spouse of an astronaut. And again, having not read the book, I wonder if Jim was trying to say something about how like what kind of expectations are put upon spouses of astronauts.
Yeah, I've read a couple of other astronauts who've talked about the relationships with their spouses and how really like it's something that involves the whole family. It's not one of these careers where you go to work, you come home and you leave it at the office. Like the spouse has to be fully invested in this, and it fully affects their lives. And the whole time I'm watching that, I'm just thinking, oh, I'd never ever want to be married to an astronaut. The stress of it, but it is something that they know going in. And I think as well, because so many of them come from a military background, it's something that danger aspect is probably not as shocking to them as it might be to some of us, because they've been in these dangerous situations before, especially test pilots. Back in the day, the actual accident rate was so high that I think, though, at the same time, I think her performance was really great because, again, it wasn't this hysterical over the top. Like, it seemed like she was in this role in this space, something she had accepted and knew was a possibility, but she didn't seem cold to it either. And it was, yeah, I really appreciated how they portrayed her and showed the amount of support that is really needed for these astronauts. And I'm sure to this day, like it must be just as nerve wracking for astronauts, spouses and families and significant others when they're watching them go off into space, because it's such an unknown for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, you made a point when you were watching. I was so confused. It seemed there was like a party of people, like a watch party happening at their house at the end of the movie. Like, who are all these people, and like, why are the astronauts there? And you made a point of saying that's actually something NASA did and still does.
Yeah, as far as I understand, again, I'm not an expert in this, but from what I understand, when a mission goes off, the family members of those astronauts actually have other astronauts who have been in space before from past missions, or people who are training for future missions, actually assigned to them to be that emotional support. And so they're there to be there for them on the day of launch, get them what they need, even if it's something like, it's raining, I'm going to get the umbrella, I'm going to figure this out, so that you can just focus on being there to support your family. And then if something does go wrong, they're there to be that support because they understand it. They live it themselves. And so they can give that bit more of a perspective, but also I think as well, they're not overreacting the way that some of us might. Like, if I got thrown into that situation, what do you say to someone whose husband is now possibly going to burn up at any moment? So I think it's something that they are very purposeful about, making sure that those families have support, especially now some of the missions are so long, keeping that connection in place. There were a lot of people in that room, though, so I'm not sure who all of them would be, but I liked the part where they had the astronauts, so Neil Armstrong and
Buzz Aldrin.
Thank you. Come in. They sat with his mom, and apparently that's what it is. It does sound like there is quite a bit of community involved in amongst the astronauts, and I wonder if that's partially from the military, because I have done a little bit of just tangential work with the military and seeing their community life and how people come together because they have that shared experience that no one else is going to understand, and they support one another. So I wonder if it came out of that, because I have seen that with military wives as well.
I know the moment where like they went and visited the grandma in the home, I was like, I teared up because I'm like, the amount of emotional strength she needs to have to be able to have this conversation with her mother-in-law, who's like clearly on the older side, and to be there for her kids as well. like in my mind, that takes as much courage and strength as it is to actually be up there flipping all those switches and peeing in a tube. The second theme that I observed, and I don't know again this was intended or not, but they certainly they make this almost like a commentary on the American public and how it's like, oh, like there's less interest in the space program, and but all of a sudden once there's something dramatic and dangerous, it's all over the news and it's all anyone can talk about. And I turned to Professor F and Nitstitch at the beginning. I'm like, is it bad that I agree with the American people? Like I actually having no personal investment in outer space exploration, it does kind of frankly seem to me as like a waste of time and money to just go up to the moon for the sake of going to the moon. And I there's all this commentary you can make about how the news media is just out to look for the next disaster, and they really glorify things that are horrible. But as more space friendly people, were you at all triggered by the portrayal of the American public?
No, for me that was pretty expected. I don't think your position is that uncommon. I think it's always been a struggle from the beginning to generate enough public interest so that this publicly funded organization, which NASA is, gets the money they need to do the missions and the science that they want to do. And I don't know. I don't know the different historical opinions on this, but I probably a case could be made that was it not for the fact that this took place during the Cold War and the arms race, we may never have gone to the moon. I mean, the amount of dedication and the hours that people had to log to develop the technology in the 60s when this technology was barely capable of doing what they accomplished with it. That without such a clear goal or purpose for it, it probably wouldn't have happened. It just required so much effort from the American, science community and engineering community, and so much money. So without those justifications, yeah, it always has been a struggle to keep the public interested enough in space, and that's a struggle to this day. Yeah, I personally wish that there was more of a consistent interest in space, but I understand it. It seems difficult for so I can see how some people would find it difficult to see what the benefits of that are. And the reality is that there is more benefit to it than just science for science sake, which is a value in itself. But there have been so many technologies that have come out of humans pushing themselves and pushing the limits and exploring in these hostile environments like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of medical advantage as well. I know, especially now, they do a lot of testing while they're up in space and when they come back, just to see how these really extreme conditions can affect the human body, and that has led to discoveries that have real effects here on Earth.
Now, Ben, the movie buff. Again, this is a movie buffy question for you. I've noticed that there's a lot of movies that kind of really critique the news media, and they really tear a new one. They're like, oh, they're terrible people. Do you feel like this movie is one of those?
Oh, geez. I don't know if I'd go that far. I think from what I've been hearing you guys talking about and thinking about the fact that, yeah, when they try to find the initial filming that they do, like the little show that they're kind of putting on as they're on their way to the moon, and then one of the media representatives tells them oh, it's not on any of the channels currently. They might play a few minutes of it on highlights. I don't know if I'd go as far to say that that the media and the news is terrible. I wonder if it's maybe more of a comment on the fact that it's unfortunate, but this is the way it is sometimes, right? I was just kind of thinking about the fact that for certain things, for certain events that we have currently, I don't know. And I mean, I know there's going to be an obvious thing here, but for the Oscars, I know for me, I'm the kind of person that I want to sit through that whole telecast, no matter whether it's 3 hours, 4 hours, 4.5 hours long. But I know a lot of other people don't want to sit through that. They want to see the highlights. They just want to know who won this, who won that, or come in at the last half hour to see who wins Best Director and Best Picture. And that kind of reminds me of what happens in Apollo 13, right? Because I wouldn't be surprised if Apollo 13 had gotten to the moon, that they would want to, that the networks would want to show them getting to the moon and landing on the moon and all that. But anything before that and after that, they're not terribly interested in. And I think that's just kind of this universal truth that sometimes people, um, instead of wanting to sit down and actually be invested in something and try and really get into it, sometimes it's like, well, you know what? It's more convenient for me to only see the highlights, to only see this one part, and that's it, or to hear about it in the news afterwards. So I don't know if I'd go as far to say that the media are terrible. I think, if anything, we kind of see how Marilyn Lovell is just kind of ticked off because I think she does have that one line where she's like, oh, the media wasn't interested in my husband going into space, but now that he's in danger and he might die, now they're interested. And I think, if anything, it's to kind of voice the frustration of characters like her and the other characters that kind of have to sit on the sidelines and wait for all of this to pan out. So I guess it's just kind of acknowledging universal truths about how we deal with these things. And, would it be better if we maybe got more invested? I think in some cases, yes, but maybe some people don't have the patience for that.
Yeah, I guess that one scene where they're like asking if they can set up a transmitter or whatever on their front lawn. I guess that's sitting with me because I'm like, that seems really like, oh, like these insensitive people from the media can't even imagine like what she's experiencing and how dare they ask that question. That therefore it kind of portrays them in a negative way. But I guess that is only really one moment of the movie. I think one final thing I kind of want to bring up is because, as you pointed out, Knit Stitch, this is basically almost a historical reenactment, is that it is a really great case study for leadership and how to handle crises because you can pretty much just play parts of this movie and say, like, this is a historical reenactment of something that actually happened and there isn't too much embellishment by Hollywood to make it dramatic. And I'm reading a book right now called Extreme Ownership, and it's written by these two former Navy SEALs, and they take all their leadership principles they learned in the SEALs and apply it to business. But one thing they talk about with this idea of extreme ownership is taking total control over what you have control over and accepting that you are responsible for what you're responsible for. And they talk about the relationship between people who are above you and people who are below you. And so when the inciting incident happens in this movie and they first encounter issues on Apollo 13, everyone immediately just goes to work. They try to work the situation. They try to assess what's wrong, both on the mission control side and both on the spacecraft. You do have that one fabricated moment of conflict that you mentioned, Professor F. But for the most part, it's people just assessing the situation and just trying to find an answer. And I think that's a really good lesson in leadership for the people on the spacecraft to not question what command control, whatever they're called, mission control. I'll get it right eventually. For them to not just question what mission control is telling them and just to do the things, you save so much time and energy by just actually enacting those things instead of kind of waiting and arguing. Because I'm guilty of this. Like if I receive directions from people, I will question it if I don't think it's the best way to go. But sometimes it's actually better just to like trust that your superiors have the right stuff.
Yeah, I like the line that Ed Harris has, which of course you kind of quoted already, Average Joe, where he says, let's work the problem, let's not make things worse by guessing. And I think, yeah, that's a testament to if someone guesses and people are like, well, you know what? Yeah, I'm sure that sounds right, so let's work with it. I think it's really great that like they had really the best people working at NASA to try and figure out these problems and have to explore every angle. And clearly they needed a leader who could make decisions quickly because not only was this a dangerous situation that they had to try and solve, but it was also time sensitive. This is not something that, you can kind of sit on it for a week and try and figure out the best option or suggestion. Time was of the essence and they really had to work quickly to try and figure this out. And I think with all of the obstacles they had in their way, that they figured it out. And I think another good thing too is how there are a number of different problems that they had to work on. But as we see in the movie, it's one problem at a time, right? If you're trying to solve 5 problems at the same time, it gets very stressful. It gets very crazy and out of control. So what do? You deal with one at a time. And once you've solved one problem, then you get on to the next one.
I mean, there was a bit of delegation going on. Like they had one team of people working on the whole carbon dioxide filter thing. They had a different set of people trying to figure out how to stick the landing. they had the astronauts in space doing their thing as well. So I agree. Yeah, they were just trying to like break it down and go one step at a time and not look at the big issues as a one giant problem. But I appreciate that as well because I know like in my work, I'm often having to, instead of trying to take everything on by myself, is to like work through other people. And depending on personality type, it's actually very hard to pass on responsibility to others because you would perhaps feel like you could do better yourself and you don't trust other people. And so, I don't know if you guys in the room with me were inspired at all by what you saw in the movie.
Yeah, I think there were some good moments. I liked right at the end when Jim Lovell starts off in that kind of I guess the driver's seat is the best I can think of, and he realizes no, like he's not actually the best person for that, and he switches with the other guy whose name I'm blanking on.
Kevin Bacon.
Kevin Bacon's character. And it kind of just showed like it's not, it was never about one man getting all of this glory, or they were all there for a combined purpose and goal. And I thought that was good. I appreciated his leadership throughout. I think he took a lot of responsibility, even when he's having to tell the one guy that he's not going to be on the mission, instead of kind of saying, well, I tried and I argued, I did all these things. He'd kind of tried to get him to stay, and he hadn't been happy about it, but he didn't let that show. He just took responsibility. He said, no, this was my call, and didn't try and pass the buck, or erode any trust in the superiors or the people making that actual decision. And I thought that was really good because it obviously was not something that he wanted, but he also knew what was best for everyone.
So I think we can come around to the final thoughts now. Apollo 13, it's a piece of historical drama. We've determined it's not a biopic, and it's the closest you'll get to a historical reenactment of actual things that happened in American history when it comes to the space race. So if you're at all interested in like learning more about American history, or you just want a real case study of how to handle leadership in a crisis, Apollo 13 is a great movie. So for myself, if I'm thinking of the Bat Cookie ratings, where we're reminding this for Knit Stitch, who's new, we rate things out of 4 Bat Cookies that go inside the Bat jar. And we do allow decimals, so it's like you could have 2.8 Bat Cookies. What an eighth of a Bat Cookie looks like, I'm not quite sure. But nonetheless, I'd have to give this movie at least, and this is me not having really an interest in space stuff and me totally thinking this whole mission was a waste of time. Like, just think of all the time and money that was wasted sending them up there just for them to come back empty-handed. I'm sure they learned a lot from this, and that was beneficial. But on the surface of all that, me having little investment in the whole thing itself, I'll still give this movie like 3.4 out of 4 Bat Cookies.
I would rate it very highly, for a number of reasons. The accuracy of it. There were very few lines from the actual dialogue that changed. One thing that I thought was interesting is the actual line that's so iconic now, I guess because of this film, the whole Houston, we have a problem. It was actually slightly different, but very slightly different. It was Houston, we've had a problem. Like, so, right down to, not making that line up, for example. They took a lot of the details and took them very seriously. One detail that wasn't mentioned that I kind of wanted to mention just before my rating, is that they actually filmed this in near weightlessness. They used a NASA training tool, which is a giant cargo plane, some sort of Boeing plane, that's hollowed out on the inside. And if you put it into a steep enough dive, you can reduce gravity to almost 0 G. It's reduced gravity, they call it. The nickname for it's the vomit comet because it often induces nausea in the occupants. But it only achieves this for 23 seconds before it has to pull out of its dive. And they filmed a lot of this in 0 G like conditions. And so just thinking about the technical challenge and commitment of the whole cast and crew who are up there with cameras, and they're wearing all this space gear and in these tight confined areas. They actually built 2 versions of the modules so that they could film from both angles in this cargo plane in 0 G, like while they're in a 23-second dive. So, just the dedication to the historicity of it all. The acting was great, not overstated. I'm going to give it a 3.8. Maybe that's my bias as a space fan as well, but I thought it was really well done.
Yeah, I think for all the same reasons, and really just again having seen the movie before, also just knowing the history of how it all ends, but the fact that it still drew me in. I was still super like tense and nervous as it was all happening. I was really impressed, and so I'd say, uh, yeah, how many decimal points am I going to go with? That's the question. I think, yeah, I'd probably go 3.7. I thought it was really good. I think it it has aged a little bit in terms of the actual picture. The color and stuff is a bit grainy, so that's probably the only thing I take off. But that's also not their fault because they were working with what they had in the 90s. So
Yeah, I think this movie is awesome. I think it is well acted, well directed, very intense. I think some of the best intense movies are the ones where you've seen them before and you watch them a second or third time and you still are on the edge of your seat. And I definitely was for this movie. One quick thing that I wanted to commend the movie on is the editing, which it won an Oscar for. And I think the editing in this movie is great because, like I said, we have the astronauts in space, we have the guys at mission control, and then we have Marilyn Lovell kind of on the sidelines, hoping and praying that everything is going to work out. So, in a way, this one story is actually kind of three separate storylines that all kind of connect and work together. And I think the way that that is juggled throughout the movie is done very effectively. Rarely do we spend too much time to the point where it starts getting boring with certain characters, right? We basically are kind of maybe at 5 minutes at most, we spend time with the astronauts or with Marilyn Lovell or mission control. And then right as things are getting kind of interesting or there's some sort of development, we then move to another storyline where we get to see other characters reacting or doing something. And I think it's always done at a good point where, okay, this is interesting, but what's happening with this person? Well, we go over here and see this thing. And yeah, it's very well edited. One of my favorite edits is probably when Kevin Bacon hears the news that he is going to go to space, and once this is confirmed, because he was part of the backup crew, he gets excited and he kind of does this silly little scream because he's really happy. And then we cut to the face of Gary Sinise as Ken, as he's just kind of trying to process the information because he's just heard that he's not going to the moon. So I think having images like that together is really effective to show how, oh, this guy's excited, but this guy's clearly not because he's hearing the news that he's not going to the moon. So the movie is really great, absolutely worth seeing. I'm going to give it 3.7 out of 4 Bat Jar cookies. Highly recommended.
So as I mentioned when we started talking about this, Apollo 13 is available for streaming on Amazon Prime Video. And of course, you can buy it as well if you want to maybe make a good Christmas gift for somebody, if they're, I would say if they're certainly any kind of space geek, or if they're just interested in American history, or just really interested in like how to approach leadership. I would even go that far as to say it's a good like gift for someone like that. So highly recommend. Thank you, John Bosco, for recommending this to us. And like John Bosco, you can message us just like the person who has emailed us this week. So, Professor F, I'm going to actually have you read out this email we got.
All right. This is from someone named Eliza Jane Phillips. Do you guys know that person? I don't know. Anyway,
she's emailed us before.
Oh, okay. So the email goes, "Hey there. I'm currently reading Ready Player One, and it's got me thinking, why is the 80s such a nostalgic period for nerd and geek culture? You see it in things like Ready Player One, Stranger Things, and other nostalgic shows and movies, as well as remakes. For example, the now delayed Dune movie. So many of the cult classics that people still love today are also from this period. There was tons of good nerdy geek content created before the 80s and since, but for some reason, this seems to be the decade folks return to. I'm curious to hear why you think that is. Thanks."
So as you were reading that, a lot of things popped in my head. First of all, the 80s is when we really saw like the rise of like home video games. So a lot of things like Super Mario and whatever that were previously not a thing were becoming popular in people's homes. You had a lot of toy-based cartoons on in the 80s. You had everything from He-Man and She-Ra to My Little Pony and Transformers. So there's a lot of, I would say, like big brand franchises that came into prominence in the 1980s. And then you had a lot of, I don't know, even I think from the comic book perspective, that's really where a lot of comic books embraced kind of like the more mature themes, and a lot of the most famous comic books in the 80s, like The Dark Knight Returns, somehow catapulted comic books to like literature status, like that in Watchmen, for example, are like two comic books that are on the like the lists of best novels ever written because they kind of broke through the ceiling of what a comic book could be considered. So in my mind, there's just a lot of material that was kind of produced in that decade, and this is giving things away. But Professor F, you were born in the '80s, so
That's right.
maybe
Well, I already gave that away when I to the Star Wars fans when I talked about between which movies I was born.
Right. So I mean, as an '80s kid, like any observations you have?
I have to say I'm actually a bit limited with that. I was born, at the beginning of the 80s, but not having any older siblings. Like I was a kid in the 80s. I kind of consider myself more of a 90s kid in that sense that I became a tween and a teen at the beginning of the 90s. So I got the 80s from TV and movies, um, almost as the decade was ending. So I actually don't have any, maybe I could think of some, but offhand, I don't have a lot of commentary.
I think this is such a big and also very interesting question that, like, heck, we could probably dedicate a whole podcast to this. But I was watching something interesting where they had mentioned that part of the reason, and this is not the only reason, but part of the reason for this 80s nostalgia is that adults who are making movies now and TV shows and are involved in different kinds of entertainment were very likely kids in the 80s, right? Maybe they were born in the 70s or maybe they were born in the early 80s and they got to experience a bit of the 80s as they were growing up, right? So that being the case, um, I was watching a video, I can't remember by who, but they were saying how it seems like every 30 years we kind of get this nostalgia cycle for something for a decade that's like a few decades old, right? So someone mentioned how there was kind of this resurgence of a love for the 50s in the 80s, right? Hence, like you have Back to the Future, you have Peggy Sue Got Married, and then I'm sure there are a whole bunch of other movies and TV shows that kind of had this love and fondness for the 50s because people who were born in the 50s were adults in the 80s making movies and writing TV shows. So I think yeah, this kind of resurgence for the 80s has a lot going for it, but I think one of the reasons is that you have people that are at the point where they look back to the 80s with fondness and they're like, you know what, I want to find a way to translate that into stories to kind of share that passion with younger people. And I think that's why we have people kind of being like, oh man, wouldn't it be cool to have lived in the 80s? Because you have people that did live in the 80s and that are kind of making love letters, if you will, in the form of Stranger Things and Ready Player One.
Yeah, we mentioned this in the episode we did on the Ready Player One movie that there's almost like a sad element of the Ready Player One universe wherein it's as if no one created new content post the 80s. I mean, the Ready Player One movie kind of brings in more modern stuff, but like the book, having not read it myself, from what I understand, is that it kind of makes it seem as though all pop culture kind of stopped creating new content in like the 80s, 90s, and in this like 2030s or whenever that movie is set, it's as if all the pop culture that exists is actually just stuff held over from the 80s, which is kind of sad to say that like it kind of presents the case like, oh, like everyone sort of gave up on being creative because there was just no new ideas. I agree this could be a whole episode in of itself, but Knit Stitch, I think you mentioned you're also reading Ready Player One right now.
I am, yeah. And it is fun to see all the little kind of 80s references that come out. I was also born in the 80s, but right at the end, so I don't really remember it, but I had, kind of some of those things that carried through into the early 90s. And I think though actually now in reading Ready Player One, something I didn't get because I saw the film first, is that it is very much meant to be one person's perspective. So there's the guy who has created the Oasis, which is the virtual world in which everyone kind of just escapes. And he loved the 80s. So it's kind of this idea like all culture, everything's kind of fallen apart. I think it's in the 2040s it's supposed to be. So they've lost everything, but this is what got preserved. And I think kind of like Ben the movie buff was saying, was preserved because this one guy, that was what he loved, and so he brought that in. It was his generation, and so yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting to think about, okay, what will be kind of carried over, in a couple decades, from the 2020s. I think there has been a lot of really good content, but it is interesting. It is interesting how often we see the 80s come up now, and just how embedded in our culture it really is.
So I'm going to take a few minutes to actually write all these topics in the batch. There were a bunch of things that were kind of brought up as we were talking last week about things that should be their own episode, and we're definitely going to add this one as well. So look forward to hearing that episode in the future. Now, Beef Pork Ribs is going to magically appear for this one short moment of the episode to remind us how you can get a hold of the show.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
Or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
Well, thanks, Beef Pork Ribs, for jumping in here. I'm sure you're tired from your wedding, but it was so nice of you to jump in and say that one piece of information. It's now time to go inside the Bat Jar and pull out a topic for next week. And Knit Stitch, since you're new, and I hate being the one pulling out of the jar myself, and I'm going to take the advantage of the fact you guys are actually here with me. I'm going to have you pull out our topic for next week out of the jar.
Okay, this is quite the honor.
Don't look. People always look inside the jar when they're, oh, wow, that was fast. Okay.
Well, I just grabbed the first thing my hand came to. So we have legacy characters. I don't even know what that means.
Professor F, as an educated man, you want to take a crack at thinking what legacy characters are?
I could take a while, I guess, but no, I'll leave that to the resident nerd and geek expert in the room. That would be you.
Oh, Ben the Movie Buff. Clearly he's talking about you. Do you know what a legacy character is?
Geez, I don't know, like characters that are so famous that they have a legacy.
Not quite. It's a term that's mostly used in comic books, but I think it's in other forms of media now as well. It's the idea of a character where like a mantle is passed on from one character to another. So, for example, The Flash is this character that has existed in comic books for almost 80 years, but there have been, I think, 5 or 6 different individual characters who have called themselves The Flash over those 80 years. So looks like we're going to dive into something a little more comic booky, which is honestly a nice change of pace after all this sci-fi stuff that's been going on lately. Not that it's bad. It's all good stuff. And I'm glad we watched this movie today, just in case people are thinking I have this hate on for sci-fi. Well, we want to thank all our special guests for being here today. So Ben the Movie Buff, thank you for coming back once again.
No worries. It's always a blast to hang out with you guys and chat about nerd culture and especially movies. I'm going to be busy the next few weeks, so I probably won't be coming back as a guest for the rest of November, but hopefully in December I'll be back to have a few more guest appearances. So, yep, it's always fun.
So, Knit Stitch, thank you very much for making your first appearance on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
And Professor F, let's see if this episode cracks new records because we have you back.
Yeah, I'm not holding my breath. I don't think this has the same appeal with those parents looking for reviews that we think may be attributed to the success of Rescue Bots.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to do a whole mini series with you on all these topics: Paw Patrol, PJ Masks. Let's just dive right into each of these franchises because I'm willing to give the people what they want. And thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week when we talk about the idea of a legacy character. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Knit Stitch.
I'm Professor F.
I'm Ben the Movie Buff.
Catch you on the flip side.
Bye.
À plus tard.
See you in the next one.